The azaleas of New Orleans bloomed with unusual intensity in the spring of 1858, their crimson and white petals carpeting the garden district like drops of blood on pristine linen. But it was not the flowers that would make this Holy Week memorable in the annals of the city's darkest secrets. It was the woman who tended the gardens of the Beaumont mansion, whose weathered hands would soon dig graves for the living and plant seeds of terror that would flourish long after Easter Sunday had passed. Sally Thibodeau had been born under a blood moon in Saint-Domingue in 1798, delivered into a world already convulsing with revolution and revenge. Her first breath had been drawn amid the smoke of burning plantation houses, her mother's screams mixing with the distant cries of masters who discovered that their human property had developed a taste for freedom and blood. By the time she was sold to Louisiana as a child of 12, Sally carried within her the genetic memory of successful rebellion, the inherited knowledge that white flesh could bleed just as easily as black. Before we dive into one of the most horrific acts of revenge in American history, I need you to understand something. If you believe that the darkest chapters of our past need to be told, that forgotten voices deserve to echo through time, click the subscribe button right now, click the like button, and tell me where you're watching this video from. Help us reach more people who need to hear these buried truths. For 28 years, Sally had served the Beaumont family with the silent efficiency that characterized the finest household slaves in New Orleans society. She had raised their children from infancy, tended their gardens with an expertise that made their mansion the envy of Royal Street, and maintained their household with a precision that left visitors marveling at the family's apparent good fortune in securing such capable help. What they never saw was the price Sally paid for that perfection, the midnight hours spent scrubbing blood from her fingers after particularly brutal punishments, the careful concealment of bruises that marked her master's displeasure, the slow erosion of her soul as she watched children she had nursed commit the same cruelties she had endured. The Beaumont mansion stood like a temple to antebellum prosperity on the corner of Magazine and 3rd Streets, its Greek revival columns rising 3 stories into the humid Louisiana air. Built in 1842 with money earned from sugar plantations along the Mississippi River, the house represented everything that made New Orleans society both magnificent and monstrous. Behind its imposing facade lay rooms filled with European furniture, walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had never set foot in America, and gardens that bloomed year-round under Sally's careful cultivation. New Orleans in 1858 was a city balanced on the knife's edge between old-world elegance and new-world brutality. The port thrived on commerce that flowed up and down the Mississippi River, bringing wealth from cotton, sugar, and human cargo to merchants who transformed blood money into social respectability. The Garden District showcased that wealth in mansions that rivaled anything in Charleston or Savannah, while the French Quarter pulsed with the energy of a cosmopolitan city where French, Spanish, African, and American cultures blended into something uniquely intoxicating. But beneath the surface, beauty lay a foundation of suffering that visitors preferred not to acknowledge. New Orleans was one of the largest slave markets in North America, a place where human beings were bought and sold with the same casual efficiency that characterized the trading of sugar or cotton. The city's prosperity depended entirely on slave labor, not just in the plantations that surrounded the city, but in the houses, shops, restaurants, and public works that made civilized life possible for its white inhabitants. Sally understood this dynamic better than most. She had been purchased at the age of 12 from the slave market on Royal Street, one of hundreds of children separated from their families and sold to the highest bidder. Her price had been $250, a substantial sum that reflected both her obvious intelligence and the training she had already received in household management. Colonel Marcus Beaumont had bought her specifically to manage his domestic staff, recognizing that a well-trained house slave could be worth her weight in gold. The Beaumont family consisted of Colonel Marcus, his wife Isabel, and their 4 children: James, age 16, Robert, 14, Margaret, 12, and little William, who had just turned 8. To the outside world, they presented the perfect image of Southern aristocracy, well-educated, religiously devout, socially prominent, and blessed with the kind of wealth that allowed them to indulge their every whim while maintaining the fiction that their prosperity came from their own superior character, rather than the unpaid labor of others. Colonel Beaumont had served with distinction in the Mexican-American War, returning home with a reputation for both military competence and casual brutality that served him well in managing his human property. He was a man who understood that effective slave management required a careful balance of paternalistic kindness and savage punishment, creating an environment where obedience was rewarded with small privileges, while defiance brought consequences so severe that few dared to risk them. Isabel Beaumont was the daughter of a prominent Charleston family, raised from birth to believe that her comfort and security depended on the absolute submission of the African people who surrounded her. She possessed the kind of refined cruelty that characterized many Southern ladies, the ability to order brutal punishments while maintaining the facade of Christian gentility that made such actions seem not just acceptable, but morally necessary. Their children had been raised in this atmosphere of casual brutality, learning from their earliest years that black people existed for their convenience and pleasure. James, the eldest, had already begun emulating his father's management style, taking particular pleasure in devising creative punishments for infractions both real and imagined. Robert possessed his mother's talent for psychological cruelty, specializing in punishments that left no visible marks but devastating emotional scars. Margaret, despite her youth, had already developed the imperious manner that characterized plantation mistresses, treating the household slaves with a disdain that seemed remarkable even by the standards of her class. Only William, the youngest, showed any sign of the natural empathy that might have made him different from his siblings. But even he was beginning to absorb the lessons that his family taught through daily example, that black people were fundamentally different from whites, that their suffering was less important than white comfort, and that any kindness shown to slaves was a form of weakness that invited disaster. Sally had watched this family for 28 years, had seen them grow from children into adults without ever developing the moral capacity to recognize her humanity. She had raised James from infancy, sung him to sleep, tended his childhood illnesses, and celebrated his accomplishments as if he were her own son. Her reward for this devotion was to watch him mature into a young man who took sexual liberties with slave girls barely past puberty and ordered whippings for servants who failed to anticipate his every need. She had been Margaret's constant companion through childhood, teaching her to read and write, helping her with her lessons, and listening to her dreams and fears with the patience of a loving mother. Margaret's gratitude for this care had been to grow into a young woman who viewed Sally as little more than a particularly valuable piece of furniture, useful for certain tasks, but unworthy of basic human consideration. The breaking point had been building for months, but Sally traced its beginning to a specific moment in February 1858, when she had witnessed something that finally shattered whatever capacity for forgiveness she still possessed. Young William, the child she had thought might be different from his siblings, had been playing in the garden when he discovered a nest of baby birds that had fallen from one of the oak trees. Instead of showing compassion for the helpless creatures, he had begun systematically torturing them, pulling off their wings and watching them suffer before finally crushing them underfoot. When Sally had tried to intervene, suggesting gently that the birds deserved kindness rather than cruelty, William had looked at her with eyes that held no trace of the child she had helped raise. "They're just animals," he had said with a coldness that chilled her soul. "Just like you." That night, lying on her straw mattress in the servants' quarters, Sally had finally acknowledged a truth she had been avoiding for years, that there was no goodness in this family worth preserving, no hope for redemption that justified continued endurance, no future that offered anything but more of the same suffering she had already experienced. The children she had raised with such devotion had grown into monsters who saw her as nothing more than a useful animal, and the master and mistress who had shaped them were incapable of recognizing the evil they had created. It was then that Sally began to plan their deaths, not in a moment of anger or desperation, but with the cold calculation of someone who had finally recognized that justice would never come from external sources. If the law would not protect her, if society would not acknowledge her humanity, if God remained silent in the face of such systematic cruelty, then she would have to create her own justice. The plan that took shape in her mind over the following weeks was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its thoroughness. Holy Week would provide the perfect opportunity, a time when the family's attention would be focused on religious observances, when their guard would be down, when the symbolism of death and resurrection would add layers of meaning to whatever action she chose to take. Sally had always been responsible for maintaining the family's extensive gardens, work that required her to dig frequently in the soft Louisiana soil. Over the years, she had developed both the physical strength necessary for such labor and an intimate knowledge of every inch of the property. She knew where the ground was softest, where tree roots would interfere with digging, where standing water might complicate her work. Most importantly, she knew which areas of the garden were rarely visited by family members or neighbors. The location she chose for her plan was perfect, a secluded corner of the property near the servants' quarters, shaded by ancient oak trees and hidden from the main house by carefully cultivated hedges. The soil there was deep and rich, easy to dig and unlikely to shift once her work was complete. More importantly, it was an area where she worked regularly, so her presence there would attract no attention from the family or neighbors. The tools Sally needed were already at her disposal. As the household's head gardener, she had access to shovels, picks, ropes, and other implements that could serve purposes far removed from their intended use. She also had something equally valuable: detailed knowledge of the family's habits and schedules, information gathered through years of careful observation that would allow her to predict their movements with deadly accuracy. Colonel Beaumont typically spent his mornings in his study, reviewing correspondence and managing his business affairs. Isabel preferred to remain in her bedroom until noon, taking her breakfast in bed and receiving visitors in the afternoon. The children followed predictable routines. James often rode his horse through the countryside in the early morning hours. Robert preferred to study in the library. Margaret practiced piano in the music room, and William played in the gardens under Sally's supervision. But Holy Week would disrupt these normal patterns. The family would attend special church services, participate in religious observances, and entertain visitors who came to share in their pious celebrations. These disruptions would create opportunities that Sally could exploit, moments when individual family members might be isolated and vulnerable. The first phase of Sally's plan involved preparation, digging the graves that would soon hold living victims, preparing the restraints that would prevent escape, and positioning the tools she would need to complete her terrible work. She began this preparation during the week before Holy Week, working in the early morning hours when the rest of the household was still asleep. Each grave was carefully excavated to precise dimensions: 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. Deep enough to prevent escape, but shallow enough that the victims would remain conscious for as long as possible. Sally lined each grave with wooden planks to prevent collapse, then covered them with removable boards that would support a thin layer of soil and vegetation. To any casual observer, the areas looked like normal garden plots being prepared for spring planting. The physical labor required for this preparation was enormous, but Sally had been strengthened by 28 years of hard work. Her hands, calloused by decades of cooking, cleaning, and gardening, proved capable of wielding shovel and pick with deadly efficiency. Her back, bent by years of subservience, straightened with purpose as she dug graves for the people who had bent it. More challenging than the physical preparation was the psychological preparation required to commit acts that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Sally had been raised as a Christian, taught to turn the other cheek and forgive those who trespassed against her. But she had also learned that Christian forgiveness, like Christian charity, was a luxury available only to those with the power to choose when and how to extend it. The slaves who surrounded her had developed their own theological understanding, one that saw God as a liberator rather than a justifier of oppression, one that viewed justice as a divine imperative rather than a human luxury. In their clandestine religious services, held in the quarters after the master's family had retired for the evening, they sang songs and told stories that celebrated resistance rather than submission, that promised ultimate victory over earthly oppression. It was in this alternative theological framework that Sally found the moral justification for what she was planning. If God was truly just, then justice must be possible, even when human institutions failed to provide it. If Christ had died to liberate the oppressed, then sometimes that liberation required acts that seemed terrible to those who had never experienced systematic cruelty. The children posed a particular moral challenge. James and Robert were old enough to be held responsible for their actions, young men who had chosen to embrace the evil that surrounded them rather than resist it. Margaret, at 12, was approaching the age where such choices became definitive. But William, despite his casual cruelty toward the birds, was still only 8 years old, possibly young enough to be redeemed if circumstances were different. Sally wrestled with this dilemma for weeks, torn between her desire for complete justice and her recognition that punishing a child for sins he had been taught to commit might be morally problematic. But ultimately, she reached a conclusion that would have horrified her earlier self, that William's youth made him more dangerous, not less. He was still young enough to learn different lessons, but he was also young enough to perpetuate the cycle of cruelty for decades to come. More practically, Leaving any member of the family alive would compromise the entire plan. William would grow up to tell the story of what had happened, would serve as a witness whose testimony could lead to consequences Sally was not prepared to face. If justice was to be complete, it had to be final. As Holy Week approached, Sally made her final preparations. The graves were ready, concealed beneath false surfaces that would collapse under the weight of a human body. The restraints were prepared, ropes and chains that would prevent escape once the victims found themselves buried alive. The schedule was memorized. She knew exactly when and where each family member would be vulnerable. Palm Sunday dawned clear and beautiful, the azaleas in full bloom, and the air filled with the promise of spring. The Beaumont family attended morning services at Christ Church Cathedral, returning home for an elaborate dinner that showcased Sally's culinary skills. They spoke of forgiveness and redemption, of Christ's sacrifice and the promise of eternal life, never suspecting that their own household servant was preparing to teach them lessons about justice that their theology had never contemplated. That evening, as the family settled into their normal routines, Sally made her final mental preparations. Tomorrow would begin the most terrible and necessary work of her life. 4 graves waited in the garden, ready to receive 4 bodies that would learn what it meant to be buried alive while still breathing. The Holy Week Massacre was about to begin. Sally Thibodeau's journey to New Orleans had begun 46 years earlier, in the smoking ruins of Saint-Domingue, where Toussaint Louverture's revolution had transformed the world's most profitable colony into a graveyard of French colonial ambitions. Her mother, Aminata, had been among the survivors who escaped the bloodbath that followed the successful slave uprising, carrying her infant daughter across dangerous waters to a Louisiana that promised safety but delivered only a different form of bondage. The slave market on Royal Street in 1812 had been a cathedral of human misery, where children were separated from parents with the casual efficiency of livestock being sorted for slaughter. Sally remembered fragments of that day, the stench of unwashed bodies packed into holding pens, the sound of chains scraping against cobblestones, the way potential buyers examined her teeth and limbs as if she were a horse being evaluated for purchase. At 12 years old, she had been considered prime property, young enough to be trained for specific duties, but old enough to begin earning back her purchase price immediately. Colonel Marcus Beaumont had been 32 years old when he bought Sally, a veteran of the War of 1812 who had returned to New Orleans with enough prize money to establish himself as a serious player in the city's slave-based economy. His first purchase had been a modest townhouse in the Garden District, his second a small sugar plantation upriver from the city, and his third the young girl who would manage his domestic staff for the next 3 decades. The colonel's background had shaped his approach to slave management in ways that would prove crucial to understanding Sally's eventual actions. Born in Virginia to a family that had lost their plantation during the Revolution, he had grown up poor but proud, educated enough to recognize opportunity but desperate enough to seize it regardless of moral cost. His military service had taught him that effective leadership required a careful balance of reward and punishment, that men would follow orders more reliably if they feared the consequences of disobedience more than they feared the enemy. Applying these lessons to slave management, Colonel Beaumont had developed a system that was remarkably effective and remarkably cruel. Slaves who performed their duties satisfactorily received small privileges, better food, warmer clothing, permission to marry, occasional holidays. Slaves who failed to meet his standards faced punishments that were designed not just to correct behavior, but to terrorize others into compliance. The colonel understood that managing 300 slaves across multiple properties required making examples that would be remembered and discussed, creating an atmosphere where obedience seemed preferable to the alternatives. Sally's introduction to this system had been swift and memorable. On her 3rd day in the colonel's household, she had made the mistake of looking directly into his eyes while he was giving her instructions. The punishment had been 15 lashes administered in front of the entire household staff, followed by a lecture about the proper relationship between master and slave that she would never forget. "You are not a person," the colonel had explained, while Sally's back bled from the whipping. "You are property that happens to be able to speak and think. Your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, none of these matter. What matters is your ability to serve the needs of your betters. Learn this lesson well, because I will not teach it twice." The lesson had been reinforced countless times over the years through incidents that demonstrated the colonel's absolute power over every aspect of her existence. When Sally had shown signs of romantic attachment to a young man named Marcus who worked in the stables. The colonel had sold him to a sugar plantation in the Delta, explaining that Sally's emotional attachments were luxuries he would not permit. When she had tried to learn to read by observing the children's lessons, she had been whipped for presuming to acquire knowledge that was reserved for white people. But the colonel's cruelty was systematic rather than random, designed to shape behavior rather than simply inflict suffering. He understood that a completely broken slave was less useful than one who retained enough spirit to work efficiently while accepting her subordinate position. Sally had learned to navigate this system by presenting a facade of grateful submission while maintaining an inner core of resistance that she hid from everyone around her. Isabel Beaumont had brought her own contribution to the household's atmosphere of refined brutality. The daughter of a Charleston family that traced its roots to the original Carolina settlers, she had been raised to see slave ownership as both a privilege and a responsibility that required constant vigilance against the inherent savagery of the African race. Her approach to slave management was more psychological than physical, focused on creating emotional dependence that would prevent thoughts of rebellion or escape. She specialized in acts of seemingly random kindness, followed by equally arbitrary cruelty, creating an environment where slaves never knew what to expect, but always feared disappointing her. Sally might receive a new dress one day, and a severe beating the next, with no clear connection between her behavior and the treatment she received. This unpredictability was carefully calculated to prevent Sally from developing any sense of security or control over her circumstances. The children had learned these lessons by example, absorbing the casual brutality of their environment until it seemed as natural as breathing. James, the eldest, had shown his understanding of proper racial hierarchy from an early age, treating the household slaves with a mixture of paternalistic condescension and casual cruelty that marked him as his father's true heir. By the age of 16, he was already managing slaves on the family's plantation, applying punishments with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to inflict suffering on others. Robert had developed different but equally disturbing talents, specializing in the kind of psychological manipulation that left no visible marks but devastating emotional scars. He understood that a slave who feared punishment would work harder than one who merely expected it, and he had developed an elaborate system of threats, promises, and mind games that kept the household staff in a constant state of anxiety about their standing in the family hierarchy. Margaret, despite her youth, had already begun displaying the imperious cruelty that characterized plantation mistresses throughout the South. She treated Sally and the other household slaves as if they were particularly intelligent pets, capable of following complex instructions, but incapable of genuine thought or feeling. Her casual use of racial slurs and her assumption that slaves existed solely for her convenience marked her as a true product of her environment. Only William had shown any signs of the natural empathy that might have made him different from his siblings, but even those signs were fading as he absorbed the lessons that surrounded him. Sally had watched with growing horror as the child she had helped raise transformed from an innocent boy into another young master who saw her as something less than human. The breaking point that had finally pushed Sally beyond endurance had been building for months, but it crystallized around a series of incidents in the early weeks of 1858 that demonstrated the family's complete indifference to black suffering. The first had involved Lucy, a young woman who worked in the laundry and had become pregnant by one of the stable hands. When Isabel Beaumont discovered the pregnancy, she had ordered Lucy sold to a sugar plantation, where pregnant women were worked until they miscarried or died in childbirth. The second incident had involved old Moses, a man who had served the family faithfully for 20 years, but was no longer able to work at his previous pace due to age and arthritis. Instead of allowing him to retire to lighter duties, Colonel Beaumont had decided that Moses was no longer worth feeding and had sold him to a farmer who specialized in extracting the last value from elderly slaves before they died. But the incident that had finally shattered Sally's ability to forgive had involved little Sarah, an 8-year-old girl who worked in the kitchen under Sally's supervision. Sarah had been born with a withered arm that made certain tasks difficult, but she had compensated with extra effort and genuine devotion to her work. When Margaret Beaumont decided that Sarah's deformity was unsightly, she had convinced her parents to sell the child to a brothel that specialized in providing exotic entertainment for white men with particular tastes. If you are enjoying the story so far, click the like button, turn on notifications, and subscribe to the channel. The sale of little Sarah had taken place on a Tuesday morning in February, conducted in the same casual manner that the family used for disposing of worn-out furniture or unnecessary livestock. Sally had been forced to dress the child in her best clothes and deliver her to the slave market on Royal Street, where she had watched a man with cold eyes and soft hands examine Sarah's deformity with the calculating interest of someone evaluating damaged goods. The price had been negotiated quickly, $50 for a child whose physical limitation made her unsuitable for normal domestic work, but perfect for the specialized market that the buyer served. Sarah had clung to Sally's skirt as the transaction was completed, not understanding why she was being taken away from the only home she had ever known, not comprehending the fate that awaited her in the basement rooms where grown men would pay to satisfy appetites too twisted for normal society to acknowledge. That night, as Sally lay on her straw mattress listening to the sounds of the other slaves trying to sleep, despite their grief and terror, she had finally acknowledged a truth that she had been avoiding for years. The Beaumont family was not simply cruel, they were evil in ways that made redemption impossible, and forgiveness a form of complicity. Every day that she continued to serve them faithfully was another day that she enabled their cruelty, another day that she participated in the destruction of innocent lives. The plan that began forming in her mind that night was not born of sudden anger or temporary desperation, but of a cold, calculated recognition that some problems could only be solved through permanent solutions. The Beaumont family would never change, would never develop the capacity for mercy or justice, would never stop destroying lives for their own pleasure and profit. If they were to be stopped, it would have to be by someone willing to pay the ultimate price for justice. The location Sally chose for their graves was perfect in its symbolism as well as its practicality. The garden had been the scene of countless hours of backbreaking labor, where she had created beauty that the family enjoyed, while treating her as if she were no more significant than the tools she used. The soil that had nourished flowers and vegetables through her care would now nourish her quest for justice, receiving the bodies of those who had treated human life as a commodity to be bought and sold. The physical preparations required for her plan were enormous, but Sally had been preparing for this work without realizing it for 28 years. Every hour spent digging in the garden had strengthened her hands and back. Every day of carrying heavy loads had built the endurance she would need. Every night of sleeping on a hard floor had taught her to ignore physical discomfort in pursuit of larger goals. More challenging than the physical preparation was the moral and spiritual preparation required to commit acts that would have been unthinkable to her younger self. Sally had been raised as a Christian, taught to forgive those who trespassed against her and to trust in God's ultimate justice. But she had also learned that Christian forgiveness, like Christian charity, was a luxury available only to those with the power to choose when and how to extend it. The theology that had sustained slaves throughout the Americas was different from the Christianity preached in white churches, focused on liberation rather than submission, on justice rather than patience. In the secret religious services held in slave quarters throughout the South, enslaved people developed their own understanding of divine will, one that saw God as a liberator who sometimes worked through human agents to bring about necessary change. It was within this theological framework that Sally found the moral justification for what she was planning. If God was truly just, then justice must be possible, even when human institutions failed to provide it. If Christ had died to liberate the oppressed, then sometimes that liberation required acts that seemed terrible to those who had never experienced systematic cruelty. The children posed a particular moral challenge, especially young William, who was only 8 years old and might still be young enough to be saved from the corruption that surrounded him. Sally wrestled with this dilemma for weeks, torn between her desire for complete justice and her recognition that punishing a child for sins he had been taught to commit might be morally problematic. But ultimately, she reached a conclusion that would have horrified her earlier self, that William's youth made him more dangerous, not less. He was still young enough to learn different lessons, but he was also young enough to perpetuate the cycle of cruelty for decades to come if he lived to inherit his father's position. More practically, leaving any member of the family alive would compromise the entire plan and expose Sally to consequences she was not prepared to face. The tools Sally needed were already at her disposal, accumulated through years of faithful service that had earned her the family's complete trust. As the head gardener and household manager, she had access to shovels, ropes, knives, and other implements that could serve purposes far removed from their intended use. She also had something equally valuable: Detailed knowledge of the family's habits and schedules, information gathered through decades of careful observation that would allow her to predict their movements with deadly accuracy. Colonel Beaumont's routine was as predictable as clockwork, shaped by military habits that he had never abandoned. He rose at dawn, took breakfast in his study while reviewing correspondence, and spent the morning hours managing his various business interests. Afternoons were reserved for social calls and political meetings, evenings for family dinner and reading. His only variation from this schedule came during Holy Week, when religious observances would disrupt his normal patterns and create opportunities that Sally could exploit. Isabel Beaumont's schedule was equally predictable, dominated by the social requirements of her position as a prominent planter's wife. She received visitors in the morning, took dinner at midday, and spent her afternoons in activities designed to maintain her family's social standing. Her involvement in church activities during Holy Week would provide additional opportunities for Sally to act without fear of interruption. The children's schedules were more variable, but still predictable within certain parameters. James often rode his horse through the countryside in the early morning hours, but Holy Week services would likely disrupt this routine. Robert preferred to study in the library during the hottest parts of the day, Margaret practiced piano in the afternoon, and William played in the gardens under Sally's supervision whenever weather permitted. These routines would be disrupted during Holy Week as the family participated in special church services and entertained visitors who came to share in their religious observances. But Sally understood that these disruptions would create new patterns that she could predict and exploit, moments when individual family members might be isolated and vulnerable to the fate she had prepared for them. The first grave was completed on Monday of Holy Week, dug in the early morning hours when the rest of the household was still asleep. The location was perfect, hidden behind a hedge of azaleas that would muffle any sounds, close enough to the house that Sally could transport her victims without being seen, but far enough away that their cries would not alert potential rescuers. Each grave was carefully excavated to precise dimensions that Sally had calculated through weeks of planning. 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. Dimensions that would accommodate an adult body while ensuring that escape was impossible once the victim was secured with ropes and chains. The graves were lined with wooden planks to prevent collapse, then covered with removable boards that would support a thin layer of soil and vegetation. As she worked, Sally found herself thinking about the theological implications of what she was doing. Burial alive was not simply murder. It was a form of judgment that would give her victims time to contemplate their sins while experiencing a taste of the terror they had inflicted on others. They would have hours to understand what it meant to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone who saw them as less than human, to face death with the knowledge that no one would come to save them. The second and third graves were completed on Tuesday and Wednesday, each one a masterpiece of concealment that would remain invisible until the moment it was needed. Sally tested each covering carefully, ensuring that it would support her own weight but collapse immediately when someone heavier stepped on it. The timing would have to be perfect. She would need to position each victim precisely over their designated grave before triggering the collapse that would send them into the darkness below. By Thursday of Holy Week, Sally's preparations were complete. 4 graves waited in the garden, ready to receive 4 bodies that would learn what it meant to be buried alive while still breathing. The tools she needed were positioned strategically around the property. The ropes and chains were hidden where she could reach them quickly, and the schedule she had memorized was ready to be put into action. That evening, as the family prepared for Good Friday services, Sally made her final mental preparations. She had spent 28 years serving this family faithfully, watching them destroy lives with casual indifference, hoping that somehow they might develop the capacity for mercy or justice. That hope was finally dead, buried as deeply as the graves she had prepared for its killers. Tomorrow would bring the most terrible and necessary work of her life. 4 members of the Beaumont family would attend church to commemorate Christ's crucifixion, never suspecting that their own household servant was preparing to teach them lessons about justice that their theology had never contemplated. By Easter Sunday, she would either be dead or free, but either way she would finally have served justice instead of evil. The Holy Week massacre was about to begin, and Sally Thibodeau was ready to dig the final graves in a garden that had been watered with too much innocent blood. Good Friday dawned with an ominous stillness that seemed to press down upon New Orleans like the weight of accumulated sins. The air hung thick and humid, pregnant with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms that would mirror the violence about to unfold in the Beaumont garden. Sally Thibodeau rose before dawn as she had every day for 28 years. But this morning carried a finality that transformed routine into ritual, servitude into sacrament. The Beaumont family would attend 3 services that day: morning prayers at 7, the traditional Good Friday service at noon, and evening vespers at 6. This schedule would scatter them across the day in predictable patterns, creating windows of opportunity that Sally had calculated with the precision of an engineer and the patience of someone who had learned that perfect timing meant the difference between justice and mere revenge. At 5:30 in the morning, Sally made her first move. Colonel Beaumont always took his morning constitutional through the garden before breakfast, a 20-minute walk that followed the same path every day, ending at the secluded corner where Sally's first grave waited beneath its carefully camouflaged surface. The azaleas were in full bloom, their crimson petals creating a carpet that would soon be watered with blood more literally than any gardener had ever intended. The colonel emerged from the house at precisely 6 o'clock, as punctual as the church bells that would soon call the faithful to prayer. He wore his finest black suit, appropriate for Good Friday observances, and, unknown to him, perfectly suited for a funeral that would begin before the morning was over. Sally watched from the kitchen window as he began his familiar path, noting the slight stiffness in his gait that came from old war wounds, and the confidence of a man who had never imagined that his property might one day turn against him. Sally intercepted the colonel near the rose bushes, appearing with the timing of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. She carried a basket of freshly cut flowers, maintaining the appearance of normal garden duties while positioning herself exactly where she needed to be for the trap to work properly. "Good morning, Colonel," she said, her voice carrying the same respectful tone she had used for 3 decades. "The azaleas are particularly beautiful this year. Would you like to see the new blooms I've been cultivating behind the hedge?" Colonel Beaumont paused, as Sally had known he would. His pride in the garden's reputation was one of his few genuine vanities, and the prospect of examining new flowers that might further enhance his social standing was irresistible. He followed Sally toward the secluded corner where her masterpiece waited, his boots crushing fallen petals with each step. "I've been working on a new variety," Sally continued, leading him directly over the concealed grave. "The color is unlike anything you've seen before. It's right here, Colonel. Just step forward to get a better view." The colonel stepped onto the false surface with complete confidence, never suspecting that the ground beneath his feet was nothing more than thin boards covered with soil and vegetation. The trap worked perfectly. The boards collapsed under his weight, and he plunged 4 feet into the carefully excavated grave, landing hard on his back with a grunt of surprise and pain. Before he could comprehend what had happened, Sally was moving with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed every action. Ropes and chains had been positioned around the grave's perimeter, and within seconds, she had secured his wrists and ankles, rendering him helpless despite his size and strength advantage. "What in God's name?" the colonel began, but Sally cut him off with words that she had been saving for 28 years. "Don't invoke God's name, Colonel. Not now. Not after what you've done to his children." Her voice remained calm, almost conversational, which made her words more terrifying than any scream of rage would have been. "You're going to die in this hole, just like little Sarah is dying in that brothel you sold her to. The difference is that you'll have time to think about your sins before the earth covers your face." The colonel's initial confusion gave way to understanding, then to the kind of terror he had spent decades inflicting on others, but had never experienced himself. He tested his bonds and found them unbreakable, designed by someone who understood exactly how to render a strong man helpless. "Sally, listen to me," he said, his voice taking on the tone he used when trying to calm frightened animals. "Whatever's troubling you, we can discuss it like civilized people. There's no need for this madness." "Civilized?" Sally laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You sold an 8-year-old girl to men who will torture her until she dies, and you want to discuss civilization? You whipped pregnant women until they miscarried, and you think we can have a reasonable conversation?" She began shoveling dirt into the grave, each load landing with a soft thud that punctuated her words. The colonel's struggles became more frantic as he realized that his situation was not negotiable, that no amount of pleading or threatening would change his fate. "The others will find me," he gasped, spitting soil from his mouth. "They'll know you did this. They'll hunt you down like the animal you are." "The others are going to join you," Sally replied, continuing her methodical work. "Your wife, your children. They're all going into the ground today. By tomorrow morning, the Beaumont family will be nothing but a memory." The dirt rose steadily around the colonel's body, and his struggles grew more desperate as the weight made movement increasingly impossible. Sally worked with the rhythm of someone performing familiar labor, pausing occasionally to rest, but never stopping long enough to allow hope to creep into her victim's mind. "Please," the colonel whispered as the soil reached his chest. "I have money. I can free you. I can free all of you." "Too late for that," Sally said, adding another shovelful. 28 years too late. By 7:30, Colonel Marcus Beaumont was dead, buried alive in his own garden while his family prepared for church services that would celebrate a very different kind of sacrifice. Sally smoothed the disturbed earth and arranged fresh flowers over the grave, creating a memorial that looked like any other garden plot from a distance. 1 down, 3 to go. Isabel Beaumont's routine was more variable than her husband's, but Sally knew that Good Friday would bring predictable patterns. The mistress always spent an hour in private prayer before the noon service, kneeling in the garden gazebo where she could contemplate Christ's suffering while surrounded by the beauty that slave labor had created for her enjoyment. At 11 o'clock, Sally positioned herself near the second grave, this one concealed beneath a bower of jasmine that filled the air with a fragrance so sweet it was almost sickening. She had brought pruning shears and a basket, maintaining the appearance of normal garden maintenance while waiting for Isabel to arrive for her devotional hour. Isabel appeared at 11:15, dressed in the black silk dress she reserved for the most solemn religious occasions. She walked slowly toward the gazebo, her prayer book clutched in her gloved hands, her face composed in the expression of pious melancholy that she had perfected for public display. "Mrs. Beaumont," Sally called softly, emerging from behind the jasmine. "I'm sorry to disturb your prayers, but I've discovered something troubling in the garden. Something you should see before the family leaves for church." Isabel paused, irritation flickering across her features at having her spiritual preparation interrupted by servant concerns. But Sally's tone carried enough urgency to overcome her annoyance, and she followed the slave woman toward the bower, where death waited beneath deceptively beautiful flowers. "What is it, Sally? We don't have much time before the service." "It's here, ma'am, under the jasmine. Something has been disturbing the roots, and I'm afraid it might spread to the other plants if we don't address it immediately." Isabel leaned forward to examine the spot Sally indicated, positioning herself directly over the concealed grave with the same confidence that had led her husband to his death. The trap functioned perfectly. The false surface collapsed, and Isabel plunged into the waiting pit with a scream that was quickly muffled by the 4 walls of earth that surrounded her. Sally's response was immediate and efficient. Within moments, Isabel was secured with ropes that had been pre-positioned for exactly this purpose, her struggles rendered useless by bonds that tightened with each movement. "Sally, what are you doing?" Isabel gasped, her voice high with panic and disbelief. "Have you lost your mind? Release me immediately." "I'm perfectly sane, Mrs. Beaumont, probably the sanest I've been in 28 years. Sally began filling the grave with the same methodical efficiency she had used for the colonel. "I'm giving you what you gave little Sarah, what you gave Lucy, what you gave Moses, what you've given all of us for so long that you forgot we were human beings capable of suffering." The dirt fell steadily into the grave, and Isabel's protests grew more desperate as she realized that her position as mistress of the house meant nothing in this reversed world where the slave held absolute power over the master. "The children," she pleaded as the soil reached her waist. "Think of the children. They're innocent in all this." "Innocent?" Sally paused in her work, looking down at the woman who had destroyed so many lives while maintaining the fiction of Christian virtue. "James is 16 years old and has already raped 3 girls in the quarters. Robert delights in psychological torture. Margaret treats us like animals. Even little William sees us as less than human. Where exactly is their innocence, Mrs. Beaumont?" "They can change," Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of falling earth. "Children can be taught different lessons. So can adults," Sally replied, resuming her work. "But you never learned them, did you? 28 years of watching you destroy lives, and you never once showed a moment of genuine compassion for anyone with dark skin." By noon, as church bells across New Orleans called the faithful to Good Friday services, Isabel Beaumont had joined her husband in the garden's secret cemetery. Sally arranged flowers over the second grave with the same care she had shown the first, creating a memorial that would remain invisible to casual observers. 2 down, 2 to go. The afternoon posed greater challenges. James and Robert would both be at the church service, making it impossible to isolate them individually during the noon hour. But Sally had anticipated this complication and planned accordingly. The evening service would provide better opportunities, as the children often returned home separately depending on their social obligations and personal preferences. At 4 o'clock, James returned from the service in the company of several young men from prominent families. Their conversation focused on plans for evening entertainment that would follow the religious observances. Sally watched from the kitchen window as they gathered in the garden, their laughter echoing strangely in the space where two graves already held their occupants. James's friends departed at 5:30, leaving him alone in the garden with an hour to kill before the evening service. This was the moment Sally had been waiting for, a window of time when he would be isolated and vulnerable, his guard down because he was on familiar territory. She approached him near the fountain where he was reading a letter from a friend in Charleston, moving with the quiet efficiency that had characterized all her actions that day. "Master James," she said, using the title that had always made her feel sick, "your mother asked me to show you something before you leave for evening service. She said it was quite urgent." James looked up from his letter with the casual arrogance that had marked him since childhood. "What is it, Sally? Make it quick. I don't want to be late." "It's over here, sir, behind the magnolia tree. Something about the garden that your mother was quite concerned about." James followed her without suspicion, secure in his assumption that no slave would dare to threaten a member of the master's family. This confidence proved fatal as he stepped onto the third concealed grave, which collapsed just as efficiently as the first two, dropping him into a pit that had been waiting for him since Monday morning. His reaction was different from his parents', where they had experienced confusion and disbelief. James immediately understood that he was facing deliberate attack. He was younger, stronger, and angrier than the adult Sally had already buried, and his struggles were correspondingly more violent. "You black bitch," he screamed, fighting against the ropes with savage intensity. "I'll kill you for this. I'll have you flayed alive." "No, you won't," Sally replied calmly, beginning the familiar ritual of shoveling earth into the grave. "You won't do anything to anyone ever again. Your days of raping young girls are over, Master James. Your days of whipping people for your own amusement are finished." James continued struggling as the dirt rose around him, his fury undiminished even as his situation became increasingly hopeless. He cursed Sally with language that would have shocked his church congregation, revealing the depth of hatred that had always lurked beneath his veneer of southern gentility. "Where are my parents?" he demanded as the soil reached his chest. "What have you done with them?" "They're here," Sally said, gesturing toward the other graves. "Right here in the garden with you. You'll be joining them soon." The revelation that his parents were already dead seemed to break something in James's spirit. His struggles became more frantic, but less coordinated, the movements of someone who had finally grasped the completeness of his situation. "Please," he whispered as the earth rose toward his neck. "I'll change. I'll be better. I'll free you all." "Too late," Sally said, adding another shovelful. "You had 16 years to learn how to be human. This is what happens when you choose to be a monster instead." By 6:30, as the sun began to set over New Orleans, James Beaumont had joined his parents in the garden's growing cemetery. Sally smoothed the earth over his grave and planted flowers that would bloom over his remains, marking the spot where another architect of suffering had finally faced justice. 3 down, 1 to go. Robert Beaumont arrived home at 8 o'clock, having lingered after the evening service to discuss theological questions with the parish priest. He was in an excellent mood, stimulated by intellectual conversation, and looking forward to sharing insights from the day's religious observances with his family. He found the house strangely quiet, with no sign of his parents or brother, despite the fact that they should have returned from church hours earlier. The servants' quarters were similarly deserted, adding to the atmosphere of abandonment that made the mansion feel more like a tomb than a home. "Sally!" he called, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. "Sally, where is everyone? Where are my parents?" Sally emerged from the kitchen where she had been waiting for this final confrontation. Her clothes were dirty from the day's work, her hands stained with soil that carried more significance than Robert could possibly understand. "They're in the garden, Master Robert," she said, her voice carrying the same respectful tone she had maintained throughout the day. "They asked me to bring you to them. They have something important to discuss with you." Robert followed her outside, his theological training having equipped him with a scholar's curiosity, but not a soldier's caution. He walked confidently toward the garden's depths, never suspecting that he was approaching his own grave. "I don't see them," he said as they reached the area where the fourth pit waited beneath its camouflage surface. "Are you certain they're here?" "Oh yes," Sally replied. "They're right here." The final trap functioned perfectly, dropping Robert into the last grave Sally had prepared for this day of reckoning. But unlike his family members, Robert did not immediately struggle against his bonds. Instead, he lay still for a moment, his intellectual mind working to process the situation with the same analytical approach he applied to theological problems. "You've killed them all," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of horror and admiration. "My parents and James, you've buried them all." "Yes," Sally said simply, beginning to shovel dirt into the grave. "Justice required it." "This isn't justice," Robert protested, his scholarly training asserting itself even in the face of death. "This is revenge. Justice comes from God, not from the hands of sinful humans." Sally paused in her work, looking down at the young man who had spent years devising theological justifications for the unjustifiable. "Where was God's justice when you sold little Sarah to that brothel? Where was divine intervention when your family destroyed every life we tried to build? I waited 28 years for heavenly justice, Master Robert. It never came, so I decided to provide earthly justice instead." "You're damning your own soul," Robert said as the dirt began to cover his body. "Murder is a sin that condemns the perpetrator as surely as the victim." "Then I'll see you in hell," Sally replied, continuing her methodical work. "But at least I'll have the satisfaction of knowing that you got there first." Robert continued his theological arguments until the earth reached his throat, maintaining his intellectual composure even as his body was consumed by the grave. His final words were a prayer for Sally's soul, spoken with what might have been genuine compassion or merely the habit of Christian rhetoric. By 9 o'clock on Good Friday evening, the Beaumont family had been completely erased from the earth by the woman they had trusted with their lives for 28 years. 4 graves in a beautiful garden held the remains of 4 people who had learned too late that treating human beings as property could have fatal consequences. Sally stood in the moonlight, surrounded by flowers that would bloom over the bodies of her former masters, finally free after 3 decades of bondage. But freedom, she was about to discover, was more complicated than she had imagined, and justice extracted its own price from those who served it. The Holy Week massacre was complete, but its consequences were just beginning. The silence that descended upon the Beaumont mansion on Easter Saturday was absolute, a quietness so complete that it seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. Sally Thibodeau stood in the kitchen, where she had worked for 28 years, surrounded by the implements of domestic service that had been transformed overnight into instruments of justice. The morning sun streamed through windows that looked out upon a garden, where 4 graves held the remains of a family that had awakened 3 days earlier, secure in their power and certain of their immortality. The discovery would come soon. Sally understood this with the clarity that follows any momentous action, when the consequences of choice become as inevitable as sunrise. The absence of the Beaumont family from Easter Sunday service would raise questions that could not be answered with convenient lies. Their failure to appear for social obligations would trigger searches that would eventually lead to the carefully concealed graves in their own garden. But Sally had not acted with the expectation of escape. She had acted for justice, and justice demanded its own price from those who served it. At 9 o'clock on Easter Saturday, the first visitor arrived. Mrs. Josephine Trem, a longtime family friend who had come to discuss arrangements for the traditional Easter luncheon that the Beaumonts hosted annually for New Orleans society. She knocked at the front door with the confidence of someone who had been welcomed into this house for decades, expecting to be greeted by the usual bustle of preparation for one of the social season's most important events. Sally answered the door wearing her finest dress, the black silk that the family had given her for special occasions. Her appearance was impeccable, her manner composed, her voice carrying the same respectful tone she had used throughout her years of service. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Tremy, but the family is not receiving visitors today," Sally said, her words carefully chosen to deflect rather than lie. "They asked me to extend their regrets for any inconvenience." Mrs. Trem's eyebrows rose in surprise. The Beaumonts were notorious for their social punctuality, their commitment to maintaining the elaborate network of relationships that sustained New Orleans' aristocratic society. For them to refuse visitors without explanation was unprecedented, suggesting either illness or family crisis of unusual severity. "Is someone unwell?" Mrs. Trem asked, her concern apparently genuine. "Should I send for Dr. Morrison?" "That won't be necessary, ma'am," Sally replied. "The family simply requires privacy for personal devotions during this holy season. They asked me to convey their appreciation for your understanding." Mrs. Trem accepted this explanation with visible reluctance, but social protocol prevented her from pressing further. She departed with promises to return the following day, never suspecting that she had just spoken with the woman who had permanently resolved the Beaumont family's need for privacy. The second visitor arrived at noon, Father Benedict Rousseau, the priest who had officiated at the Good Friday service that none of the Beaumont family had attended, despite their reputation for religious devotion. His concern was both pastoral and practical, motivated by genuine worry for his parishioners and awareness that their absence had been noted by the entire congregation. Sally met him at the door with the same composure she had shown earlier, but she could see in his eyes the sharper interest of someone trained to recognize deception and evasion. Father Rousseau had heard countless confessions, had learned to read the subtle signs that revealed hidden truths, and something in Sally's manner triggered his professional instincts. "Good afternoon, Sally," he said, his voice gentle but probing. "I've come to check on the family. Their absence from yesterday's service was quite noticeable, and several parishioners have expressed concern." "The family as well, Father," Sally replied, maintaining her respectful tone despite the increasing difficulty of the deception. "They chose to observe Good Friday in private contemplation rather than public worship. Colonel Beaumont asked me to express their regrets for any worry their absence might have caused." Father Rousseau studied her face with the intensity of someone who had spent decades learning to distinguish truth from falsehood. Something in her expression, perhaps the slight tension around her eyes or the careful precision of her words, suggested that she was concealing information of significant importance. "I see," he said slowly. "And are they available to speak with me now?" "I have some parish business that requires the Colonel's attention, and Mrs. Beaumont had volunteered to organize the Easter flower arrangements." "They're not available at the moment, Father," Sally said, her composure beginning to show hairline cracks under the pressure of sustained deception. "They've asked not to be disturbed today. Perhaps you could return tomorrow." Father Rousseau's training had taught him to recognize the signs of a soul in crisis, and everything about Sally's demeanor suggested someone carrying a burden too heavy for normal human endurance. Her careful composure, her precise words, her obvious exhaustion, all pointed toward recent trauma of extraordinary magnitude. "Sally," he said gently, "if something has happened, something that troubles your conscience or threatens your peace, you know that you can speak freely with me. The seal of confession protects any communication between us. Whatever burden you're carrying, you don't have to bear it alone." For a moment, Sally's mask slipped, revealing the exhaustion and spiritual turmoil that lay beneath her careful composure. The temptation to confess was overwhelming. To share the weight of what she had done with someone whose calling involved the forgiveness of sins and the restoration of troubled souls. But confession implied repentance, and Sally was not repentant. She had done what justice required, had taken actions that the legal system and social order would never have permitted, but that moral law had demanded. To confess would be to betray not only herself, but everyone who had suffered under Beaumont cruelty, everyone who had died unavenged, everyone who would have continued to suffer if the family had been allowed to live. "Thank you for your concern, Father," she said, her composure reasserting itself. "But there's nothing troubling my conscience. I'm simply tired from the extra work that Holy Week requires. The family will be available tomorrow." Father Rousseau left with obvious reluctance, his pastoral instincts telling him that Sally was concealing something of enormous significance. But without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, he could not force the issue, could not violate the social protocols that governed interactions between white clergy and black servants. If you are enjoying the story so far, click the like button, turn on notifications, and subscribe to the channel. The third visitor arrived that evening. James Morrison, a business associate of Colonel Beaumont, who had come to discuss a cotton transaction that required immediate attention. His concern was purely commercial, motivated by financial interests rather than personal affection, but his persistence proved more problematic than the genuine worry of earlier visitors. Morrison was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through the application of economic pressure and social influence. When Sally attempted to turn him away with the same explanations she had offered others, he responded with the casual arrogance of someone who viewed black servants as obstacles to be swept aside rather than people to be reasoned with. "I don't have time for this nonsense," he declared, pushing past Sally into the front hall. "I need to speak with Marcus immediately. The cotton market is fluctuating wildly, and delays could cost us thousands." Sally found herself in an impossible position. She could not physically prevent Morrison from entering the house without creating a scene that would attract unwanted attention. She could not summon Colonel Beaumont without revealing that he was permanently unavailable. She could not maintain her deception in the face of Morrison's determination to speak with his business partner immediately. "Sir, please," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperation that she struggled to conceal. The colonel specifically asked not to be disturbed. "Perhaps if you could return tomorrow." "Tomorrow will be too late," Morrison snapped, moving deeper into the house. "Marcus, where are you? We need to discuss the Henderson contract before the markets open Monday." He strode through the mansion calling for Colonel Beaumont, his voice echoing through rooms that would never again hear the master's response. Sally followed helplessly, knowing that each passing moment brought discovery closer, but unable to prevent the inevitable revelation of what she had done. Morrison's search led him inevitably to Colonel Beaumont's study, where he found the desk covered with papers that should have been reviewed and correspondence that should have been answered. The colonel's business affairs were too important and too time-sensitive to be ignored, even during Holy Week, and the accumulation of unattended work suggested an absence that went beyond religious observance. "This is highly irregular," Morrison muttered, examining documents that bore dates from several days earlier. "Marcus never lets business slide like this. Something's wrong." He turned to Sally with the suspicious intensity of someone who had built his fortune by recognizing deception and exploitation. "Where is Colonel Beaumont? And don't give me more nonsense about private devotions. A man doesn't ignore his business interests for religious reasons, not when there's money at stake." Sally realized that her carefully constructed deception was collapsing, that the web of lies she had woven was insufficient to contain the truth of what she had done. Morrison's commercial interests had led him to notice details that social visitors might have overlooked, inconsistencies that revealed the impossibility of the Beaumont family's supposed seclusion. "I told you, sir," she said, her voice growing smaller as her options dwindled. "The family is engaged in private observances. They'll be available tomorrow." Morrison's response was swift and decisive. He grabbed Sally by the shoulders, his grip painful enough to leave bruises, his face twisted with the rage of someone who saw black resistance to white authority as a personal insult requiring immediate correction. "You lying creature," he snarled. "Well, you know exactly where they are, and you're going to tell me right now. I don't have time for games." The physical assault triggered something primal in Sally, a response born of 28 years of abuse and refined by 3 days of successful violence. Her hands moved without conscious thought, finding the letter opener on Colonel Beaumont's desk and driving it deep into Morrison's neck before he could react. Morrison staggered backward, blood spurting from the wound, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He had struck black servants countless times without consequence, had viewed physical dominance as his natural right as a white man, had never imagined that his victims might be capable of retaliation. "You," he gasped, his hands clutching ineffectively at the wound. "You can't. I'm white. You can't." "I already have," Sally said quietly, watching as Morrison collapsed to the floor, his blood staining the expensive carpet that Colonel Beaumont had imported from France. "And I can't let you tell anyone what you've seen." Morrison died within minutes, his life flowing out through the gash in his neck, while Sally stood over him with the same calm efficiency she had shown while burying the Beaumont family. 5 bodies now lay on the property, 5 witnesses to the price of treating human beings as property, 5 monuments to the kind of justice that emerged when legal systems failed to protect the innocent. But Morrison's death created complications that Sally had not anticipated. Unlike the Beaumont family, whose disappearance might be explained by travel or illness, Morrison's absence would be noticed immediately by business associates who expected him at specific meetings. His horse waited in the stable, his carriage stood in the drive. His obvious intention to conduct business with Colonel Beaumont would make his disappearance impossible to ignore. Sally dragged Morrison's body to the garden, her strength honed by decades of physical labor, her determination fueled by the knowledge that discovery was now inevitable. She dug a 5th grave in the soft Louisiana soil, working by moonlight with the efficiency of someone who had perfected this grim skill over the past 3 days. By dawn on Easter Sunday, James Morrison lay beside the Beaumont family in their secret cemetery, but his death had accelerated the timeline of discovery beyond Sally's ability to control. The web of lies that had protected her secret for 3 days was collapsing, and she knew that the morning would bring visitors who could not be turned away with gentle deceptions. The first to arrive was Sheriff Thomas Babineau, summoned by Father Rousseau, whose pastoral concern had overcome his respect for social protocol. The priest had spent Saturday night wrestling with his conscience, torn between his duty to respect the privacy of his parishioners and his growing certainty that something terrible had happened at the Beaumont mansion. Sheriff Babineau was a practical man whose position depended on maintaining order in a community where social stability required careful management of racial tensions. He had built his career on the understanding that black challenges to white authority had to be suppressed immediately and completely, that any sign of successful resistance could inspire dangerous thoughts among the enslaved population. He arrived at the Beaumont mansion with 2 deputies and a warrant to conduct a welfare check, legally justified by the family's failure to attend Easter services and their unexplained absence from social obligations. Sally met them at the door with the same composure she had shown earlier visitors, but she could see in their eyes the official suspicion that would not be satisfied with polite explanations. "We need to speak with Colonel Beaumont immediately," Sheriff Babineau announced, his tone carrying the authority of law enforcement rather than social courtesy. "Several people have expressed concern about the family's welfare, and I'm required to investigate." "The family is not available, Sheriff," Sally replied, her voice steady despite the certainty that her deception was about to be exposed. "They've asked for privacy during this holy season." "That's not acceptable," Babineau said, pushing past her into the house. "I have a legal obligation to verify their safety. If they're here, they can tell me themselves. If they're not here, I need to know where they've gone." The search that followed was thorough and inevitable. Sheriff Babineau and his deputies moved through the mansion systematically, noting the accumulation of unattended correspondence, the meals that had been prepared but not eaten, the beds that showed no signs of recent occupation. Every room told the same story, that the Beaumont family had not been living in their house for several days, despite their supposed presence. The discovery of bloodstains in Colonel Beaumont's study led to questions that Sally could not answer, without revealing the truth of what she had done. The evidence of struggle, combined with the mysterious disappearance of the entire family, pointed toward violence that could not be explained by illness or voluntary travel. "Where are they?" Sheriff Babineau demanded, his patience exhausted by the mounting evidence of deception. "What have you done with the Beaumont family?" Sally stood in the mansion's front hall, surrounded by the luxury that slave labor had created and maintained, and recognized that the moment of revelation had finally arrived. She had known from the beginning that her actions would lead to this confrontation, had accepted the consequences of her choices before she began digging the first grave. "They're in the garden," she said simply, her voice carrying the calm acceptance of someone who had completed necessary work and was prepared to face whatever followed. "All of them. They're buried in the garden they forced me to tend for 28 years. The confession sent shockwaves through the law enforcement officers who had expected to find evidence of kidnapping or robbery, not the systematic murder of an entire white family by their trusted household slave. Sheriff Babineau's face went white with rage and horror, his hands trembling as he processed the implications of what Sally had revealed. "Dear God," he whispered, "you killed them all?" "Yes," Sally said, maintaining her composure even as the deputies moved to restrain her. "I killed them all. They deserved to die for what they did to my people, and I was the instrument of justice that finally made them pay." The investigation that followed confirmed Sally's confession in gruesome detail. The 5 graves were excavated under Sheriff Babineau's supervision, revealing the remains of Colonel Marcus Beaumont, his wife Isabel, their children James, Robert, Margaret and William, and businessman James Morrison. Each body showed evidence of having been buried alive, a method of execution so horrific that it shocked even law enforcement officers accustomed to the casual brutality of antebellum violence. The trial was a foregone conclusion from the moment of Sally's arrest. Louisiana law in 1858 provided no possible defense for a slave who had murdered white people, regardless of provocation or justification. The only question was whether Sally would be executed quickly or subjected to the kind of prolonged torture that was sometimes applied to slaves whose crimes were deemed particularly heinous. Sally's confession was complete and unrepentant. She described in detail how she had planned and executed the murders, explaining her methods with the same precision she had once applied to managing the Beaumont household. She expressed no remorse for her actions, no regret for the lives she had taken, no plea for mercy from the court that would decide her fate. "They were evil," she testified when asked to explain her motives. "They destroyed lives for their own pleasure, treated human beings like animals, sold children to brothels for money to buy new furniture. The law wouldn't stop them. God wouldn't stop them. So I stopped them. If that's a crime, then I'm proud to be a criminal." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Judge Armand Thibodeau, no relation to Sally despite the shared surname, sentenced her to death by hanging, the execution scheduled for May 15, 1858, exactly 2 months after she had begun her reign of terror in the Beaumont Garden. But Sally's story did not end with her trial and sentencing. Word of her actions spread through the slave communities of Louisiana like wildfire, carried by servants who worked in the courthouse, by slaves who overheard their masters' conversations, by the underground network of communication that connected enslaved people throughout the region. The story that emerged in the telling was more myth than history, transformed by the needs of people who lived without hope into a legend of successful resistance that proved such things were possible. In some versions, Sally had killed dozens of white people before finally being captured. In others, she had escaped and was living free somewhere in the north, inspiring other slaves to follow her example. But the version that proved most enduring was the one closest to the truth, the story of an ordinary woman who had been pushed beyond endurance and had chosen action over submission, justice over safety, death over continued servitude to evil. This story resonated with enslaved people throughout the South because it reflected their own experiences of injustice and their own fantasies of revenge. Sally's execution on May 15, 1858, was attended by thousands of spectators who came to witness the death of the most notorious slave rebel in Louisiana history. She walked to the gallows with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout her trial, refusing the blindfold and declining the opportunity to make final statements. Her last words, recorded by a newspaper reporter who had covered the trial, were addressed to the enslaved people in the crowd. Remember that they bleed just like we do. Remember that they die just like we do. Remember that justice is possible if you're willing to pay its price. Sally Thibodeau died at 12:07 p.m. on a sunny spring day, her neck snapping cleanly from the hanging that ended her life but could not end her legacy. Her body was buried in the Potter's Field, reserved for executed criminals, marked only with a number rather than a name, but her story lived on in the hearts and minds of people who would never forget what she had accomplished. The Beaumont mansion stood empty for years after the massacre, its reputation forever tainted by the violence that had occurred within its walls. Eventually it was sold and demolished, the land converted to commercial use that erased all physical traces of the family that had lived and died there. But the garden where Sally had buried her victims became a pilgrimage site for enslaved people who could find ways to visit without attracting attention from their masters. They came to stand where justice had finally been served, where a woman like themselves had proven that resistance was possible, where the powerful had learned that their power was not absolute. The Civil War came 3 years later, bringing the freedom that Sally had died for but never lived to see. Former slaves throughout Louisiana remembered her story, passed it down to their children and grandchildren, kept alive the memory of a woman who had chosen death over submission to evil. Today, Sally Thibodeau's name appears in no history books. Her grave bears no marker. Her story is told in no museums. But in the oral tradition of African American communities throughout the South, she remains a powerful symbol of resistance and justice, a reminder that some evils are so profound that they can only be answered with the most extreme measures. Sally Thibodeau's legacy reminds us that justice is not always served by courts or delivered by governments, but sometimes emerges from the hands of those who have suffered injustice most deeply. Her Holy Week massacre was more than an act of individual revenge. It was a declaration that human dignity cannot be destroyed, that the powerless possess forms of power that the powerful never suspect, and that sometimes the only way to stop evil is to kill it with your own hands. Her garden is gone. Her graves are empty, her victims are forgotten, but her story continues to bloom in the hearts of everyone who believes that justice deferred is not justice denied, only justice delayed until someone brave enough to pay its price finally steps forward to serve it. That is Sally Thibodeau's Easter gift to history, the knowledge that resurrection sometimes requires death, that new life sometimes grows from old graves, and that the meek really will inherit the earth, one burial at a time. Anastawatimanzantuk, the Holy Week massacre of 1858, ended with 5 bodies in shallow graves and 1 woman on the gallows, but its true conclusion lies in every moment when the oppressed choose resistance over resignation, when justice emerges from the most unexpected places, when ordinary people become extraordinary through their willingness to pay any price for what they believe is right. Sally Thibodeau planted seeds in that garden that are still growing today, still blooming in the hearts of everyone who refuses to accept that evil is permanent, that injustice is inevitable, that the powerful will always triumph over the powerless. Her Easter resurrection was not her own. It was ours, purchased with her blood and watered with her courage, growing still in the garden of human dignity that no amount of oppression can permanently destroy. And if you like this moving story, don't forget, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and share this video with more people to help the channel grow and continue doing this beautiful work.